Okay, here we go with, um, I just realized I always start this with okay. It's just funny. Okay, here we go with the history of herbalism. We're going to do this in two parts. Today's lecture and then the next lecture, which will also be primarily on history. And then on Friday, we'll talk about safety and you'll hear from some practitioners, which I think will be pretty cool. So this is just a beginning. And again, we're not going into much depth. It's like 2 days of a lot of history, but it's very interesting in terms of helping you get a better sense of context and a better understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about Western medicine and herbalism and the various ways that humans have worked toward trying to heal from problems. So what do you know to begin with? Let's take just a moment to examine your assumptions, your presuppositions about the history of herbs. Do you know anything about it? Probably most people know nothing about the history of herbs except, yeah, they're like superstitions or traditions. People used to use them, but they're just, a big fat placebo effect. That might be what most people know or think they know before they question their assumptions about herbs. It's sort of this myth that, oh my goodness, before modern medicine, people just died all the time. That's the myth, that people died all the time, and any problem that walked by, they would just fall prey to without any help and with nothing. So it wasn't nearly that bad. Certainly, modern medicine has created a lot of advantages and has helped save a tremendous amount of lives. But herbalism and past kinds of medicine were not zero either. They weren't nothings. They weren't just plain superstition. And it wasn't like luck of the draw. There were actual healing properties that were used from plants to help people. And there were people that knew a fair amount about helping. There were also people that didn't know anything about helping that would try to help. So, of course, in the hands of somebody who doesn't know anything or is unskilled, you're not going to get very good results. Same thing now. In the hands of a physician who is very poor, you're not going to get very good results. Not Stone Age, sorry, before that, the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals used herbs. It's hard to even imagine this group of, dare we call them people, who are genetically connected to many of us. So if you are European in your background, you probably have a little bit of Neanderthal genetic material in you, between 1 to maybe 3 or 4%, maybe as high as 5. But there is some amount of Neanderthal genetic material. If you are from Africa, African descent, you probably have very little or none. And whatever you have probably came from any sort of European ancestor you might have. And so, for example, my husband has nothing in terms of Neanderthal genetic heritage. I do have some. I can't remember how much it is, but it's, I don't know if it's 3 or 5%. It's a fair amount, comparatively, it's interesting to look at how that all worked. Neanderthals were there, interbred with the ancestors of the human race, and left some genetic material. They also had a history that we can barely kind of comprehend just through looking, anthropologists looking at what they've left to history 60,000 years later, right? They used herbs. They used herbs for reasons, again, not just superstition. They used them because they worked. Yarrow was a primary herb that has been found with Neanderthals. Yarrow is really helpful for stopping bleeding. So that might be one reason why Neanderthals really prized this particular herb. Bleeding, fevers, nosebleeds, tooth pain, that sort of a thing is what yarrow can be helpful with. The question is, how did they know to use these particular herbs? How did they figure it out? Did they just experiment? Did they watch animals? Sometimes animals will use herbs medicinally, herbs that they wouldn't normally eat, they will eat for medicinal reasons. People can observe that. certainly people were much better at observing the environment then than they are now in general, where, now we have whole generations that hardly even go outside, much less spend enough time outside to make useful observations about how the earth worked. So you've got animals, you have the potential of experiments. I mean, you've got many, many thousands of years over which to look at how something works and to collect data. Also, many herbs have a distinct aroma. Particularly, there are fragrant herbs that have lovely, lovely smells, or herbs that are not very good smelling. They're very, very kind of bitter. And then you've got the smell of rotting meat, which is not good. So a lot of times what people would use were some of these spices that were very aromatic, and they would use them to cover up the rotting smell of meat. And the aromatic spices also are highly antimicrobial. And so things that we currently season our meat with or our food with, these aromatic spices also are antimicrobial and will help fight infection that might come from meat that is past its prime, per se. And so there are a number of things that we can speculate about. Of course, we don't know how it all worked. There's legends of the gods came down and told people how to use herbs, all kinds of ideas. We don't know. We can only speculate. But obviously, they had some knowledge. That's the one thing we do know. And so 60,000 years ago, I can't even comprehend what that is. It's just beyond what I can comprehend. We also know that separate cultures that were separated by thousands of miles independently found the same use for the same herbs. So you have an herb that might be a little teeny different in one habitat versus another, but it's still essentially the same herb. When you see different cultures using the same herb for the same things, you know it must be because that herb does those things. It's not that they both were struck from the sky with the same craziness. So for example, hops or mints, the herbal family of mints, are often used to soothe the stomach. They do this. They do this no matter what culture you live in, they still do it. White willow bark is used for pain and inflammation. It's another example. So you can see if you're using it for the same thing and you're not, if you're independent in terms of where you came around to see it, then it seems to add evidence, or the weight of the evidence that supporting the idea that herbs really do work for these things. Okay. After the Neanderthals, after the Stone Age, we're going to talk a little bit about the Stone Age. There's this idea of what herbs meant to a culture. In our culture, we sort of separate the idea of medicine from the rest of our lives. Medicine, you go see a doctor if you have to, but you don't make it part of your life. In the ancient world, herbs were a part of your life. And so they were all bound up in the religion, in the daily, day-to-day, everything. Herbs were part of that. Your whole system of living was involved with ritual, with herbs, with your religion, with your environment. And so it's hard to separate that like we do medicine now. It's hard to take herbs out of the entire system of living and look at them separate from the system. They were part of the system. And if you think about the idea of a holistic approach, looking at all of the things instead of just looking at a pathogen, you can see how the idea of herbs being part of life is much more connected to that holistic system. That is a holistic system, really. There are about four, you could argue for four major traditions, isolated in their own geographical areas. Major traditions. One is traditional Chinese medicine, TCM. A lot of times you'll see it abbreviated TCM. Then there's Ayurvedic medicine, and this came about in the continent of India. There's Native American medicine. We're not going to talk a lot about that. It's sort of beyond the subject of this course, but that was definitely a whole tradition in itself. And then there's European medicine, we'll speak the most about European medicine because that was the most directly related to American herbalism that we're really focusing on in this courses. We'll talk about some of these other kinds because we are really at a place where we're integrating much more, or learning from other cultures and seeing value in other cultures. So it's good to understand the history of American herbalism, but also knowing that there are these other major traditions that are extremely valuable. Prehistory-wise, we've got people using medicinal herbs, Ice Age people using medicinal herbs, the same ones used in Russia and the same ones used in North America. You've had some plants in use since the late Stone Age. There was the remains of a man found in Italy who had lived in 3300 BC. They call him the Iceman. And he had with him with holes in it and a leather strap run through it so he could carry it with him, indicating this was valuable, right? He had some mushrooms. And so the question was, wow, because he was in a glacier, you could see these things, that he had actual mushrooms because they hadn't disintegrated. And so the question was, why does he have these mushrooms? And further investigation showed that he had an intestinal parasite, and the mushrooms would have been an excellent method of resolving that parasite. And so what that shows us is that there was some form of medicine being practiced in 3300 BC, a long time ago. And so herbs have been around. I guess that's the idea. Since the late Stone Age here, for indigenous Americans, we're talking 40,000 years ago. Again, I can't wrap my head around that. There's a plant called yarrow. We just mentioned it for bleeding in teeth in the Neanderthals, but also this plant is most important for indigenous Americans. Now, I just found this plant on my property here in Virginia, wandering around outside. I looked down at this little, kind of unmowed meadow area that we live close to. And here's this yarrow. Beautiful plant, and you can see it's just beautiful. Very important herb. It stops bleeding. That might be one of the primary reasons why it was important. It does other things too. Nettle, angelica, bearberry, also very useful for indigenous Americans. There is an environmental influence. And what I mean here is not just how the growing conditions are, but looking at the overall life cycle, the overall, how the environment works. So for example, in the Himalayan mountains, you have high mountainous areas, harsh conditions, or in the Andes. In the Nile River Valley, you have this river that surges and then gets much more small. So you've got up and down with the river. And that helped lend itself to this idea of a cycle of life. And so the whole culture revolves around the cycle of the environment. And so this up and down, back and forth, cyclical nature of the Nile and the surrounding river valley had an influence on their use of herbs, their component of their worldview, their religion, all of these things. There is some history that's recorded, and of course there's a lot of history that is not recorded. So part of what historians think is that when you can record things, that means that you're belonging in more of the literate upper classes. The lower classes who were illiterate weren't recording things. They were sharing them, they were passing them down. There was a lot of tradition, not long recipes that were written down. And so you see some writings of recipes, medicines, trade notes, etc., lots of writings. And then there are traditions that are not written because they've just been handed down over time by their thinking, lower class people that weren't literate and weren't writing, still had an influence on history. And so it doesn't have to be written down for it to have been real. That's what we're saying. You can look at some of these traditions and imagine the reason the tradition is still around is because it was a thing, and this was the way it was passed down. And so lots of traditions permeate our culture still. This idea, you may have heard the song, Schoolhouse Rock song, 3 is a magic number. That's a long, long historical tradition, that there's something magical about the number 3. That's in a lot of different cultures. A lot of different religions have looked at that idea or used that idea, or that idea has started from the religious significance. There's this great story, I love the story, of this man in India. He was trained for 7 years in medicine. After the 7 years, he was told by his trainer, or the physician who instructed him, to go and collect all the plants that he could find that were not useful for medicine. Everything you could find that's not useful for medicine. He was gone for a month, and he came back and he said he could not find anything that was not useful for medicine. And at that point, his instructor said, go. You now have the knowledge to be a physician. I think that's a wonderful story. What I have found is, as I look more and more and more at a lot of plants, there is a tremendous number that are useful for so many things. I remember when I first found a plant that was useful for depression, and I thought, oh my gosh, look, I have found the plant. And I'm thinking there must be like maybe 1 or 2. And it's amazing that you can find a plant that helps with depression. Like, wow, how crazy is that? And I was just kind of assuming it was one plant, because I was really stuck in allopathic thinking. I had not been able to learn how to think as an herbalist at all. I was starting by myself. I had no training, and I was just looking in the literature, and then I come to find out there are lots and lots and lots of plants that have antidepressant effects. And in fact, it's not just even a specific antidepressant effect that works. Sometimes when you get your whole body working better, that results in less depression. There are multiple ways to that goal. And what I saw was that plants are really, really useful. And the more you know about them, the more medicinal value you can find. India and China, lots of history here, lots and lots of history, very old history of herbal use as their medicine, and whole systems, the traditional Chinese medicine system and the Ayurvedic system. They have ancient texts far older than our European claimed Hippocrates that we always kind of look toward as, this guy was the one where when we think back to the history of medicine, we go, oh, Hippocrates. Hippocrates was the guy. Well, in China, 3400 BC, in India, 2500 BC, thousands of years earlier, they were using herbs in a very systematic way to increase healing and to solve problems. Assyria was a long time ago, right? There are serious tablets that mention herbs found from 2100 BC. There was this idea that you could have herb doctors and knife doctors, so think surgeons, and then word doctors. Well, what do you think word doctors were? I think they were psychologists, right? Herb doctors, knife doctors, and word doctors. And this Assyrian influence all along the spice route from Europe to Asia. There are lots of things that were being traded back and forth in these spice routes. Recently I read about how some of the coca plant, I think it was a cocaine derivative, cocaine in Egypt tombs, in burial sites in the pyramids. So that's kind of interesting. We just make these assumptions that we know what happened back then, and that there wasn't as much trade as there actually was. Much more trade than we thought, much more interconnection of cultures than we realize. The world was not this vast, disconnected place that we assume it was. And so the Assyrian spice route was huge in terms of connecting people, but also helping bring medicinal spices to the Middle East. Egypt, there's something called the Ebers Papyrus that was found written in 1500 BC, which at this point doesn't seem like it was that long ago comparatively, right? It contains 500 plants. Interestingly, there was a use of moldy bread on wounds to prevent infection. This in Egypt in 1500 BC. And so we're taught that it was like this random, oh my gosh, this guy discovered penicillin, like never happened before. But here we have moldy bread in Egypt in 1500 BC. So there's more going on than we know. We have a very small understanding of what is involved in history. The Egyptian Ebers papyrus contains about 1/3 of the herbs that we use today in our Western pharmacopoeia. So that's really something to think about. A whole third of those herbs were known, discussed in this just in this papyrus. Egyptians loved garlic and onions. They were kind of called the stinky people because they were all about garlic and onions. And garlic and onions are extremely useful for good health, extremely useful. So the Egyptians had some stuff going on there. Then we start into the history of European herbalism. And of course, like I said, we start with Hippocrates. Hippocrates was a man who lived in Greece, and he was a kind of like the true herbalist. He believed in what you could call the people's medicine, this really kind of democratic point of view, not elitist, that anyone can go out into their backyard and pick these things and use them. You don't need a lot of expertise to use a lot of herbs. He advocated for lifestyle help to strengthen the body. So you recognize some of these herbalism ideas, strengthening the body, making sure that your biological terrain is resistant to pathogens. Instead of trying to kill the pathogens, you're strengthening your biological terrain. So he's called the father of medicine for a lot of reasons. He wrote and examined and kind of ran his own little observational studies on a ton of different things. He advocated for air, fresh air, a good diet, exercise, clean water. He would say, don't use anything that is harmful. So if you think about the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, you should read the whole thing. The whole thing's pretty interesting. But yeah, first do no harm is a part of that. And what he says is don't use plants that have any sort of a harmful nature at all. There are plants out there. So the idea, if it's natural, it's good. That's a very simplistic idea that doesn't work. Don't go with that. Go with knowledge, listening, wisdom, judicious learning, etc. But Hippocrates really advocated for equal access to herbs and that the use of these basics to improve people's health. Dioscorides, oh gosh, I practice pronouncing this. Dioscorides. Yep, that's what it was. Dioscorides was this military guy. He traveled with the military as a physician. He published the first reference on herbs for Europe, not until AD 78. Hippocrates was a few hundred years before that. But so Dioscorides published this herbal reference, basically gathering information as he wandered around Europe. Used as a reference then for 1,500 years. So the man wrote a book that lasted, right? He included 600 herbs in this manual. So he was important. Then we've got Galen. Galen came a little bit after Dioscorides. This guy was Rome's leading physician. What's really interesting about him is he's really put together the practice of combining a lot of herbs in very, very complicated formulae. And so Hippocrates' herbs were fairly simple, and you could combine them certainly, but Galen here, he would put together like 40, 50, 70 herbs for his he would call them galenicals. The galenicals were very expensive because they involved so many different things. Not all of them were actually plants. They were exclusive. They appealed to the elitist. And so this idea of the democratic, the people's medicine became shifted into this idea of exclusive, complicated formula that were the property of the physicians. And so instead of going to your backyard to get your medicine, you had to go see a physician to get your medicine. There was this thing called theriac. We'll talk about this in a second. Theriac was a whole complex combination of herbs. Galen improved on the theriac that was there. He called his improvements galine, and theriac was very much in vogue because it pretty much was all the things that might help with poisoning put together. And so it's like you just went and collected everything that you thought might help with being poisoned, put it in one medicine, and then people would drink this all the time. It was very highly in demand because everyone was poisoning everyone else in Rome eventually. So as Rome was disintegrating and before it fell, there was so much intrigue. Theriac became very, very sought after because poisoning was so common. The idea of theriac turns into this idea of treacle. Also known, garlic is known as poor man's treacle. And that is kind of interesting because garlic in itself is so powerful against very many things: poisoning, antifungal, antimicrobial, antiviral, very health promoting stuff. And so poor man's treacle, garlic. Theriac kind of ended up being seen as treacle in later as the centuries went on. So we've talked about the notable men, but what you have to see is that most of the herbalists along the path we don't know about, but there are women, because women were the one who went and collected the herbs. In large part, women did. Some men did, but in large part, women did this. They're the ones who were the primary healers. They're the ones who were the wise women, the local midwives, the herbalists. What became many of who became known as witches were wise women herbalists. Even now, 90% of people in the US will consult a person, usually a woman, before they consult a doctor. They'll just check their symptoms out with somebody, and it's usually a woman. After Rome fell, so this was 400, 500 AD, right? And you may remember that the Roman Empire extended all the way to England at that point. And so there are lots of advances in medical knowledge as the Roman Empire grew. After the capture of Rome, things really stagnated. Everything now in the middle of medieval ages was dominated by the Catholic Church, and this whole connection and growth in medicine just quit because the Catholic Church wanted to control all of the things that happened in Europe. And what was seen as disease became suffering and punishment. And so instead of looking at expanding the role of medicine, the Catholic Church managed things and promoted this idea that disease equals punishment and suffering is just and good. And so it's good to suffer. There were whole cultures destroyed by the Catholic Church for the sake of promoting the church. And so from their perspective, you can kind of understand where they're coming from the perspective of the cultures that were destroyed. You can feel, unhappy about that. But the fact is that the Christian empire destroyed a lot of competitors so that it would win out. And when it destroyed those competitors, it destroyed their rituals, their stories, and their medicine. They had little tolerance for local medicine. The idea was either God will heal you or he won't heal you. You don't interfere. This is up to God, and your job is to suffer. The idea is you neglect the body. Don't think about the body. Everything that has to do with the body is bad. Everything that has to do with the spirit is good. And so if you have this collection of healing herbs, what you're engaged in is paganism and needs to be punished and wiped out. And so lots of little traditions throughout Europe that were local herbs that would help heal things were totally wiped out. They were not allowed, and the people who advocated for them were burned as witches. So they got rid of a ton of knowledge, just wiped out. Women healers were seen as evil. Herbalism was the occult. Using herbs was banned. You could have miracle cures through faith. That was okay. But medicine was seen as intruding on what God's plan should have been. There were monks, Benedictine monks who kept herbs, but the herbs they kept were primarily the herbs that you could get from the Holy Land. And so their herb gardens were full of herbs from the Holy Land. They did share their herbs and healing with some people as an act of compassion, not as an act of getting in the way of God's will, but as an act of compassion. And then the church began to try to compromise with the surrounding cultures so that it could enfold some of those beliefs that people loved into the church culture. And so it took what they had and then it put the stamp of Christianity on top of it so that you could kind of still do it under the approval of the church because now it was a Christian thing. So in that way, you could still have a little bit of herbalism that was happening pretty low key, but it was pretty low key. When you're incorporating things into Christianity, here's a number of examples. They're very, very interesting examples. Christ banishing gout to the elder tree, using Christian phrases instead of pagan phrases when you're collecting herbs. That became a way to make it okay. Making some pagan rituals into Christian rituals. Some of that you know about, kind of an interesting thing. And then here's an example I want to read to you a little bit about St. John's wort. So St. John's wort is this yellow flower that you see here on the screen. It's a really beautiful flower. And then, let me move my face because I'm covering up this thing. Up here you can see what happens after the flower is crushed. You see this red on the woman's finger. That's not her blood. It's not damage. It is the redness of the flower that happens when you crush the flower. When you crush the flower, red, it bleeds red essentially. And so I'm just going to read this to you because it's pretty cool. Yellow flowers that blossom proficiently at midsummer. When they are crushed between the fingers, the red blood swells out. For the German heathens, this was the blood of Baldur, the mortally wounded sun god. For the Celts, it was the blood of Belinos or Bel. Christians dedicated it to John the Baptist, whose blood was transferred into the plant when he was beheaded during that time of solstice. And so it happened that the devil cannot stand the herb, but is forced to flee. And so it became known as demon flea. That's one of the names of St. John's wort is demon flea, incorporating that kind of legend into this St. John's wort herb. The Dominicans shared this belief. They ordered this herb burned as an incense when they questioned witches. So ironic, right? Because Satan could not whisper any answers to the witches when they were burning St. John's wort. So that's one example of using a Christian legend to make a plant kind of okay, to give them the approval to use this plant because we're calling it St. John's wort, not whatever other pagan things it used to be. And so some herbalism was incorporated into Christianity and therefore preserved. A lot of it wasn't. A lot of it wasn't. And so when we look back and we think about history, we often think of Europe medieval era. European medieval era was different than China, than India, than Japan, than Africa. There are lots of things that were happening in those other places that were sort of stopped in Europe. And so be careful to kind of get stuck in this idea that European history is all the history that there was and nothing else was happening in the rest of the world. Lots of things were happening. For example, in China, China was very active. China traded, they were all over the world and they had big, huge parties, you could say, that they did not invite the Europeans to. The Europeans didn't really know much about them because the Europeans were really kind of stuck doing their own thing. But the Chinese knew about the Europeans and they didn't invite them to the parties because they thought that they were barbarians, which I find so amusing. It's hard to disagree. When the Romans came and gave us indoor plumbing in Europe, and then we stopped using it when they left. Okay, that seems a little barbaric, right? Why did we stop? Why did we decide, oh, the Romans are gone, I guess it's time to pee in the house again? I hope you're laughing. Yeah, okay. Next guy we're going to talk about. This is a man in Egypt who basically collected a lot of information and then wrote books um, where he compiled all this information. And so very, very important because he was able to preserve a lot of knowledge. He did do some work in terms of replacing galenicals with tinctures. A tincture is essentially you take the plant and you use a substance, usually alcohol, to extract the medicinal qualities of the plant. And so those chemicals that act on the body can be extracted in a number of ways. Some chemicals are extracted with water and some are not. Some are extracted with alcohol and some are not. And so it takes a lot of knowledge to be able to figure out what chemicals you want to extract and what is the best method of extraction. People have been working on this, again, for thousands of years. And so there's a lot of knowledge out there that is very valuable. And Avicenna did look at some of this and developing pharmacies, that sort of thing. In fact, this was where the very first pharmacy idea came from, was from this man. Then we have the Saint Hildegard. Saint Hildegard, a woman who was famous for her herbal knowledge, and along with a number of other things, writing, composing music. And she was like a wise woman only because she was Saint Hildegard. She was approved of by the church. She relied on simples. Now, simples means single herbs. Just back to Hippocrates, when you're wandering around in the backyard or whatever, and you come across an herb, or you're out in the hills walking and you come across an herb and you use that one herb, that's what we call a simple, as opposed to a complicated compound or a complicated formula like the galenicals. So she was very, very useful in terms of being a wise woman, in terms of collecting herbal knowledge. And the last point is, it's good she didn't live later because she probably would have been burned as a witch. Witches were burned for 350 years at least. We still had some of that happening. Whoops, let me go back in America, as you know, in Salem, etc. A lot of suspicion, a lot of strange ideas, a lot of it, I think, being a need to control what you don't understand or to blame, to provide some sort of a scapegoat for things that happened that were bad. Witches were known as having their own poisonous herbs, but interestingly, they were herbs that were very useful medicinally. The devil's herb, also known as belladonna, is a useful medicinal herb if you know what you're doing. People who don't know what you're doing should not touch this because it is a poisonous herb. So is a lot of medicine. A lot of pharmaceuticals are poison, and it's about the dose. How much do you take to just do the little thing that you need instead of taking a lot and then having the poison take over and kill you? So there was belladonna, and then there's foxglove, that is an important part of heart medicine, digitalis. So those were a couple herbs known as some of the witches' herbs. That the idea, eye of newt, when people, in Shakespeare, when he says eye of newt in, I think it was Macbeth, eye of newt is another name for mustard seed. So just kind of makes it interesting to think about, what were they really talking about when they're using eye of newt? Mustard seed can be pretty medicinal, pretty useful. In Salerno, Italy was a place where they had a medical school that started in the medieval ages. And this place developed laws about medicine. Very interesting. They tried to establish a standard. And so here's the standard for what will make it so that you can call yourself a physician. So you have to have gone and had university study, and you have to study Hippocrates and Galen. If you don't study these two men, then you can't call yourself a physician. This got rid of the local herbalists. Now, if you were a wise woman or wandering around and you had a lot of knowledge, if you didn't go to university, you could no longer call yourself a physician. And so, again, we're seeing some elitism poke in, working against Hippocrates' original, well, it probably wasn't his original idea, but Hippocrates' intention that medicine is the people's medicine. Herbs are are democratic. Everyone has access to them. The spice trade was another player, in addition to being evidence of the use of spices and medicinals from across the world and sharing those. The spice trade also was an indicator of where people were going to find medicinal things. It wasn't just about, wow, our food is so boring without cinnamon. It was more than that. Europeans had developed a real taste for spices. The Crusades were a major player in that. Once you had people go crusading in the Middle East, they brought back with them spices and the sorts of things that people got a taste for. And then when the Ottomans blocked that spice route, they're looking for other ways around it. Where else can we go? We really, really want these spices. And so Columbus, can you find us another path? And so Columbus went and tried to find another path. From America, he brought home a number of things that became very, very important. Of course, tomatoes, we know of tomatoes there, but one of the things he brought home was cinchona bark. That was huge, huge, because malaria was a real problem. And what Columbus brought home was essentially a cure for malaria. So talk about a golden journey, hugely valuable. Other foods that came from America that are medicinally useful, as well as kind of being interesting as a side note: corn, potatoes, carrots, lima beans, strawberries, tobacco. If you think about a lot of cuisine in Europe, you think about tomatoes in Italy and potatoes in Ireland. These things were originally from America. There are two herbs that Columbus brought home with him: passion flower, and that is what you see pictured on the slide. This is a picture of passion flower. You can see it's just an exquisite, exquisite flower. It has amazing effects in terms of helping with anxiety and in terms of helping with stomach upset. And then there's another one called sarsaparilla, which is a lovely herb. We'll talk more about those herbs in the future, but just as a kind of side note, you can see different herbs, different areas, some herbs some of the same herb in different areas that are used the same, some different herbs that are used similarly because they have similar actions, but they're just different herbs in different places. Lots of things came from America. They came from China, they came from India, they came from all over the world to be a part of European culture. Some of them were used openly, medicinally, some of them not. The church took over a lot and limited, very hard limited the amount of physician learning and training until the Enlightenment, and until after 1500, which is where we'll pick up next time. And I'll see you then.